There is something about our Western culture, and maybe more specifically our American culture, that loves a good rag to riches story, right? We love those stories, the stories of people that overcome many things and rise to the top. We love the stories that we hear about people who come from humble means and who overcome so many problems, and their drive and their tenacity and their hard work brings them to places that we could hardly ever imagine. These are the stories that we tell as a culture. These are the stories that we love. These are the stories that perhaps identify who we are. Maybe it's because that's a part of who we are as American people. Our nation rising up out of incredible odds to be free. Maybe it's because there's something that we hope that is inside of us that we hear in these people that are driven, these people that fight for what they want and what they believe. Maybe we hope something good will come of our hard work. But if we look closely at these stories, if we dig a little bit deeper, a lot of these stories of people who have risen above their station, these stories of people who have made a name for themselves, we come to see that this drive, this achievement, often comes at a cost. Sometimes it comes at a cost to these very people that are so driven to achieve something. Sometimes it costs others, people that they love, or maybe even some of their rivals. And other times, the cost ends up affecting the very thing that they're passionate about, the very thing that they care for. We love these stories, but oftentimes when we dig deeper, we find that there is a cost to the drive. This summer, a couple of weeks ago, our family went on vacation and we got the opportunity to go to New York. And while we were there, we got to see Hamilton, the Broadway musical that has become very popular. And of course, Hamilton is the story of our founding father, Alexander Hamilton. And if there's ever anyone who really came up out of virtually nowhere and accomplished amazing things without having a name to begin with or money to begin with, it is certainly Alexander Hamilton. He was an orphan. He immigrated to this land. It wasn't the country yet, but he came into New York, didn't have any money, but he was very smart. He was very intelligent. And he was gifted in writing. And he used his giftedness and his passion and his drive to accomplish incredible things. This nobody ended up being General Washington's secretary. And in fact, he served on Washington's cabinet. He was Treasury Secretary. And he fought for the things that he believed in and was passionate about. Of course, he wanted to make a name for himself, and he was driven to do that, but he also believed in things. He believed in the Constitution, and he fought hard for that, and he believed in his own economic plan, and he fought hard for that. But what we find is that this drive came at a cost. And eventually, it cost Hamilton his life. Because of his drive, because of his passion for what he believed in, he often angered his friend and rival, Eric Burr. At one point, when Hamilton chose Jefferson over Burr, Burr had had enough, and Burr believed that Hamilton cost him the presidency. He became angry, and he challenged Hamilton to a duel. And one early July morning, they met in Weehawken, New Jersey for this duel. Now the story goes that Hamilton was there, one who never would back down. He was there to face his rival. But when it came time to shoot, Hamilton just pointed his pistol in the air and threw away his shot. Oftentimes people would do that as a show of respect, that they wouldn't back down, but they weren't willing to take someone's life. The story goes that that's what Hamilton did, but that's not how Burr reacted. Burr, perhaps because he was so angry, perhaps because he believed that Hamilton was going to take his life, instead of firing his shot and throwing it away, pointed it right at Hamilton and killed him. His drive came at a cost, a steep cost. We see it in other things too, in other stories of our history. We see it in some of the innovation and some of the inventors that we know and we love. Their drive gets them to accomplish incredible things, but it comes at a cost. A lot of us know the story of the Wright brothers, correct? The Wright brothers were very gifted, they were very smart, they were driven. They owned a bicycle shop in Ohio, and they were great businessmen, and they were also wonderful engineers, and they came up with this plan for a flying machine. And they worked on it for years and years until 1903 they took flight in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. They were able to do what people thought was impossible. Flight. An engine-run airplane, motor-run airplane. And of course they had to work hard to receive that plane. Not everyone believed it. And finally they got their flying machine patented. But it wasn't enough for them to be the first. They wanted to run, be on top of the whole industry. And so as years passed, they continued to fly, but others learned to build airplanes as well. And where the Wright brothers kind of held their information in secret, there were others that wanted to share that so that people could grow and that the industry could expand. And one of those people was Glenn Curtiss. Glenn Curtiss had built his own flying machine, and he was ready to share that information with the military and with others so that the industry could grow. But the Wright brothers wanted to keep it on top. They wanted to stay on top of the industry. And so they ended up suing Curtiss for patent infringement. And they kept him tied up in court for years. And after it was all said and done, they barely won anything. But they ended up stifling innovation in the very industry that they launched. They were driven. That drive came at a cost. It cost. We love those stories, but oftentimes we see that there is a severe cost. When we look at our story today, when we find Jacob in the passage today, we know that Jacob is a very driven individual. Jacob will do whatever he has to get what he wants. Now, the thing that Jacob wants is good. He wants God's blessing. What he hungers for, what he's driven for, is God. But Jacob, as we know, will do anything he can to get God's blessing. He sells his brother, he buys his brother's birthright over soup. He tricks his father into giving him the blessing. And all of that comes at a great cost. Where we find Jacob in the story today is he's on the run. He has to leave town. He has to leave his household. He cannot be around his brother because his brother Esau is ready to kill him. He's pretty much lost almost everything poor guy doesn't even have a pillow, it seems, doesn't it? He has to use a rock to lay his head on. Here he is at the lowest point. Everything is a mess. His family has been torn apart. And some of what we don't see in this is some of the great cost here. You know, his mother loves him. Rebecca loves Jacob, and she fears for his life. And so she has her husband, Isaac, to send him away. She's afraid that Esau is going to kill him, and so he's sent away. Her hope is that he will go away for a short time, and he can come back. Esau will go out in the woods, and he'll go back to hunting, and he'll forget his anger. So she sends him away to save him so that she can have him back. And the irony is once she sends him away, Jacob is gone for 20 years, and she never sees him again. They never see each other again. That's the cost of what he's done to get the blessing. The family will never be the same. Things are torn apart. In fact, he now is heading to a land that is away from the land that was promised to his grandfather Abraham and his father Isaac. He's going in the direct opposite direction. In fact, he's going back toward the area where Abraham left from. He's going in the wrong direction. And here we find him today at his lowest point, in a terrible situation. He's running for his life. He's torn up and messed up his family. He's in the wilderness, and he lays down on a rock. And it's when he's at his lowest point, that's where God shows up. God shows up. Now, I want you to think for a minute. If you had just lied to your father and tricked him into giving you something, and if what you tricked him to giving you was the only thing that your twin brother ever wanted, that's all Esau ever wanted was the blessing. And if you had created this chaos and conflict that has sent your family torn apart, if all of this happened and then God shows up to you, what do you think God would say to you? In your mind, what would you be thinking God's message would be to you? Don't you think that you would feel that God would really give it to you? That God would tell you how you've messed up, you better get it straight, you better get it right. Look at all of this that you've done and created. Isn't that what you would think God would say? But that's not what God says to Jacob at all. Listen to what God says. The Lord stood beside him and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and your offspring. And your offspring shall be like dust, the dust of the earth. And you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And all the families on the earth shall be blessed in you and in your offspring. And I also want you to know this. Know that I am with you and will keep you wherever you go. God doesn't lecture Jacob and set him straight. God opens up the heavens and shows him his glory. God says to him, I'm going to keep my promise. I'm going to work through you. And you are going to be a blessing to everyone on earth. At his lowest point, God shows up. God offers promises. Blessing. You know, when we read these stories about Jacob, we learn so much about God and how God interacts with us. think what we see here is that God shows up in a difficult time for Jacob, and he shows him, the most amazing thing, right? There's this ladder, and angels are ascending and descending. Here's heaven that seems to be opened up. I wonder if what God is saying is look at this, Jacob. Look at all of this. You don't have to steal this. You don't have to trick your way into this. I'm right here beside you. And I keep my promise. I think it says something else about God, about how God responds to us. What we find in this is that God does not ultimately judge us on our worst mistakes and our bad judgments. God looks at Jacob. Jacob's made some bad mistakes. He's hurt a lot of people. But God doesn't seem to identify him by those mistakes. God seems to identify him within what God has the ability to do, and he sees in Jacob a wonderful, incredible future. Things might be a mess now, but you're going to be a blessing to a lot of people. And God sees us not by our mistakes, but by God's greatest good. We can go back to Hamilton, the musical. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it. Maybe you're at least a little familiar with the story of Alexander Hamilton. What we see in the story of Alexander Hamilton is tied up in his story is the story of Aaron Burr. And what we know of Burr, what he is remembered for, is he's the one that shot Hamilton. He had been vice president. He almost won the presidency, was elected as vice president of the United States. And we hardly remember that. What we remember is that he killed Alexander Hamilton. And after that one moment, his life was changed forever. History was changed. He is known for that one moment, that one lack of judgment, that one mistake. After that duel of Weehawken, he went into seclusion, and I don't think he hardly ever came out again. Not just the rest of his life, but history has identified him for his mistake, for that one bad moment. Can you imagine? Can you imagine if we were judged by our worst day? Our one bad moment? But that's not what we see with God. God doesn't judge Jacob. God does not identify Jacob. God does not see Jacob in his messiness, in the worst moments of his life. Instead, God sees potential. And God sees what God can do through Jacob. And maybe that's why the Bible is such a mixed bag when it comes to Jacob. When we read these stories, we know he's a trickster and he's a liar and he's a cheat. But when we hear about Jacob, the Bible likes him. God likes him. And maybe that's because the Bible and God identified and judged Jacob not by his mistake, by his potential. God sees, because God keeps God's promises. Right here. Right here in Genesis, we hear the gospel. Jacob will not be identified by his mess. He will be identified by what God is able to do through him. And that's true for us. That's what we believe as Christians, right? We are not identified by our mistakes, by the worst part of who we are. Instead, we are received by the best of what God has ever done. We are identified through God's love on the cross. Good news. Right here in Genesis. Jacob, in his worst moment, God shows up. He shows him heaven and the angels in glory. He says, I'm always with you and I'm going to keep my promises. God does not judge Jacob or identify Jacob by his mistakes, but rather through what God can do. God does not identify us with our mistakes. God sees